The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, I will table a document called an open letter to Nova Scotia union members, which the Premier signed and published in the paper in 2013. The letter says, the Nova Scotia Liberal Caucus believes in the collective bargaining process and in protecting workers' rights. Now, today, Mr. Speaker, the courts of our province are in chaos, and we're in the sad situation that prosecutors have been forced into picketing Province House together with their colleagues from Legal Aid and the Justice Department and other unions around the province, despite the fact that this is the last thing any of them want to do. Will the Premier admit that his conduct this week towards Crown attorneys is a nullification and a contradiction of the commitment he made in this open letter to the people of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker. No, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is we continue to have open, free collective bargaining. Crowns are welcome to come back to...
Order, please. The Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, the Crowns are welcome to come back to the table, Mr. Speaker, to continue what I have said, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the honourable member doesn't want to hear the facts. She wasn't here, Mr. Speaker, when the Democratic Party stripped the right away from paramedics to strike, Mr. Speaker, not in advance, Mr. Speaker, of them taking that action, Mr. Speaker, on the final day before they were about to go, Mr. Speaker. It was that party, Mr. Speaker, that took away the right to strike from paramedics. And, Mr. Speaker, I was here that day, Mr. Speaker, when every union leader in this province marched their way over to the Red Chamber, Mr. Speaker, and supported that government, Mr. Speaker, because that was then, this is now, Mr. Speaker. We have a 7% pay raise on the table, Mr. Speaker. 17% is unreasonable in any stretch of the imagination, Mr. Speaker. What about those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who are looking for us to provide, Mr. Speaker, supports for low-income Nova Scotians? Housing, Mr. Speaker. Pre-primary. Where's that funding coming from, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier refers to the history of a government elected 10 years ago. I would like to refer to the history of this government going back 5 years ago, when in 2014 this government introduced essential services legislation in Bill 37 on health care workers, which effectively eliminated in that situation, similarly, the right to a meaningful strike. Does the Premier admit, since we're thinking about history, that that action too was a nullification and a contradiction of the commitment he made in that open letter in 2013?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, only union leaders, Mr. Speaker, and the New Democratic Party believes that in this province, every healthcare worker should have the right to strike regardless, without having any essential service in place. That's exactly what you're promoting, Mr. Speaker. They have said when they were in power, Mr. Speaker, they gave them the right.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor. This will be the last time.
They gave them the right to strike, Mr. Speaker, without ever once worrying about patients. The fact of the matter is that bill puts the patients first and protects their right to strike.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
It has been a day, Mr. Speaker, in which a person's mind naturally runs back to the recent events of our collective bargaining history in Nova Scotia. I couldn't help but thinking that today, being with Crowns outside, not just about healthcare workers, but thinking back to that day in 2016-17 when the collective bargaining rights of teachers were overrode by legislatures. Mr. Speaker, this government created chaos precisely in the healthcare sector. By undermining collective bargaining for healthcare workers, it created chaos in education by doing the very same thing for teachers, and today we're at the situation of chaos in the courts. Let me ask the Premier, what planet would a person have to be on to think of this as a government that really believes in protecting workers' rights?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, let me remind the Leader, he may have forgotten, Mr. Speaker, that the government he belonged to, Mr. Speaker, in their collective agreements with teachers, signed a 7.5% pay raise, Mr. Speaker, in 3 years, at the same time cutting $65 million out of classrooms. So let me get this straight. They took $65 million from the kids of this province so they could get a labour agreement with the NSTU, Mr. Speaker. I will not do that on behalf of our children. You may think that's okay. I don't, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, who in their right mind believes that healthcare workers should have the right to strike regardless without any essential service? I'm standing with patients and students. They can stand with union leaders.